Hello and welcome back. I'm Zoom Vo. Today is our last day of the Mindful Healthcare Summit, and we're going to be looking at how mindfulness and compassion can be applied into and transform individuals as well as organizations and cultures within healthcare. Today, we're looking at the research behind compassion, stress, and how compassion can change individuals and systems. Joining us is health psychologist, author, and lecturer at Stanford University, Kelly McGonigal, who has her PhD in psychology. Through the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism, she co-authored the Stanford Compassion Cultivation Training, or CCT, and studies how social connection can promote health, resilience, and stronger communities. So welcome, Kelly. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So before we talk about compassion and mindfulness, I'm wondering if you could lead us through a way that we can experience it in our lives and in our bodies, especially a way that a busy healthcare professional might be able to experience it during their day-to-day life and work.
Sure. And well, let me just say, I love that you actually said to experience it in your body, because one of the things we know is that compassion can be considered a mind-body state or experience. And we can actually feel it in our bodies as well as feel it or sense it in our minds. And it can have real effects on our physiology and how we deal with the stresses of everyday life. So I'll explain something you can actually, as you're watching this, you can do it with me, or you can just listen to it and try it when it feels more appropriate in your life. I think that's like a great way to approach any sort of practice or meditation. And this is called heart breathing. And I always like to explain what something is before I ask people to do it, like full consent. So what I'll be describing is a visualization in which you imagine breathing in and out of your chest as if your nostrils were not on your face, as if your nostrils were like right above your heart, and you could breathe into the chest, into the heart, and that the breath would move from the heart into the lungs. I realize that for healthcare providers, the inaccuracy of this can be a little alarming, but there's a real feeling to it if you actually try it. So we'll do that, and while you're doing that imagery and sensing the movement of the breath in and out of the heart, I'll invite you to bring to mind something that you take strength from, or something that inspires you, and to connect to your compassionate motivation or intention. And that's it. And in everyday life, it actually takes less time than I've already used to set it up. This is something that when I work with healthcare providers, often it's something they'll do when they're washing their hands or sanitizing their hands for the millionth time, or they might do right before they walk into a clinical encounter, before they open that door and say hello to a patient. So this is the type of practice you could use in those moments, or when you're exhausted and you're about to handle some of your electronic paperwork. Okay, so let's get to the visualization. You can do this with your eyes closed or open, but begin to notice that you're already breathing. It's happening. It's the miracle of life. You're already breathing. And for a moment, you don't even need to breathe in any particular way. Just let yourself be breathed. And as you notice your in-breath and out-breath, there is a quality of expansion that happens when you breathe in. Again, it's totally natural. It's already happening. And you can sense that expansion around your physical lungs. And when you breathe out, you can sense that expansion dissolving. So if you were to do this practice in real life, you might simply bring your attention to your breath, and for 1 or 2 breaths, sense that quality of expansion as you breathe in around the lungs and the heart, and sense the softening, the dissolution of that expansion as you breathe out. And for another breath or 2, imagine that you could actually breathe right into the center of your chest, almost as if your nostrils were on your chest or over your heart. And you could breathe in and sense that quality of expansion deepen, as if the breath were nourishing or strengthening your heart. And then you sense the breath almost as an offering from your heart, exhaling from the lungs through the heart and out of the body. And again, I'm taking way more time explaining this than you actually need to do it when you're practicing it, because once you sense the image, you can do it in a second. There is this quality, this feeling state when you begin to imagine the breath moving in and literally expanding the heart like it expands the lungs. It just gives you this feeling of connecting to your heart and connecting to the reserves that can sustain you. And so you do that for a couple of breaths, and then you imagine or bring to mind something that you draw strength from or that inspires you. For some people, this is going to be a religious aspect or faith. For others, it's their deepest motivation for practicing in medicine or healthcare, remembering their big why, their purpose. For some people, it might be bringing to mind a specific individual, thinking about their kids or thinking about the patient they're about to interact with. Or it could be thinking about the community that supports them. It's anything that brings to you a sense of strength or inspiration or positive motivation. And you actually imagine breathing it into your heart. Again, this idea of strengthening and nourishing your heart. And as you breathe out, imagine sending that intention or that motivation into the space around you, into the world around you. So you're connecting to your compassionate strength and motivation. And as you exhale, you allow yourself to imagine sending it into the world, taking in for yourself and sending out as an offering, that thing that gives you strength or your own motivation or your own compassionate energy. And again, when you're doing this in real time, the whole thing takes maybe 3 breaths. But some of the research on this particular breathing technique shows that it does a couple of things. So one of the things it does is it can help balance the nervous system in a way that increases vagal activity or vagal tone or RSA, things that we know are an index of a balanced nervous system that leaves you ready to engage, including engage with challenges, but in a way that's relatively centered and grounded. So you're bringing your best self through your autonomic nervous system to whatever challenges await. This meditation has also been shown to increase positive emotions like hope and social connectedness that can also be real resources for not just the challenges of healthcare, but of course for any interaction or any moment that you're entering, any moment that matters. So I love this exercise because it tends to have a pretty quick acting effect on both your mind and on your physiology. And it's something that can be done when you're doing those little rituals that are so common, all those little loose ends that you have to tie up, or all those regulations that you have to follow. You might as well integrate in some of those things that can feel like hassles or can feel sometimes divorced from the meaning, the deepest meaning of medicine. You know, how when you're doing that hand sanitizer, to actually infuse that meaningless ritual with a deep sense of purpose and self-care.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kelly. I think you spoke to the power it can have both in our physiology as well as our emotions, our psychology, and how it can be integrated in a really practical way for very busy professionals. I want to ask you a little bit more about the neurobiology of this, because we spoke about the compassion being embodied, and you made a choice to have us focus on our lungs and our heart. And I'm guessing that was not an accident, that was very intentional. Why the heart and lungs, and what does that have to do with the neurobiology of compassion?
This is a really interesting question. So I actually would love to talk a little bit about what's happening in the brain during moments of compassion in a way that maybe doesn't touch too directly on the heart and lungs. I think that in many traditions, people talk about the heart as the seat of compassion for a multitude of reasons. One of which is that when people report being moved in a positive way, including feeling things like compassion or feeling sympathetic joy, being like moved to tears at somebody else's good fortune or good news, feeling moral elevation when you feel moved by witnessing somebody else's courage or kindness, all these emotions that I talk about as being moved in a positive way, people almost always talk about feeling it in their heart. And, you know, there's all sorts of interesting visceral reasons why that might be. But there's no doubt that bringing more attention to sensations around the heart can give us access to the embodied experiences of these emotions that allow us to engage with life in a way that is skillful and satisfying. And that, you know, because I think too often we know what fear feels like in the heart pounding. Sometimes we know what like an adrenaline rush feels like. And maybe those other emotions are a little bit more subtle, but just as visceral. But let's talk a little about what's happening in the brain during compassion, because I often will actually walk people in my classes through, I don't have the schematic of it or any fMRI data to show you, but I often walk people through the different regions of the brain that seem to be activated and co-activated. It really helps people understand how complex and what an unfolding process compassion is. So, and I'll do this in sort of a very in a loose sketch way rather than getting too deep into it. But one of the first things that happens when people experience what we would describe as compassion, which I haven't even defined yet, but I would define as being aware of suffering, being moved or touched by that suffering in a way that gives rise to the desire to relieve that suffering, which is joined by a sense that there's something you can do. So you choose to engage, And hopefully you feel a kind of a warm glow at your decision to engage. And sometimes that's characterized by a sense of satisfaction after you help someone. Sometimes it's characterized by a sense of connection to the person that you are trying to help. Sometimes it's characterized by a sense of affirming your own values. So even if you try to relieve the suffering, but there's nothing you could do in that moment to take away someone's pain, you can still feel a warm glow. It doesn't have to come from actually fixing a problem. It can come from affirming your values and feeling connected to the person that you are trying to help. So that's compassion. And often it starts in the brain. It looks a lot like a stress response. Often the first signature you'll see is activation of perhaps the amygdala, perhaps areas of the brain associated with vicarious pain, areas like the insula, areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, areas of the brain that basically say, this is a moment that matters, and something is at stake. And often when we notice that it is suffering, it activates areas of the brain. It's not just this is a moment that matters, but this is a moment of distress, or this is a moment of threat, or whatever the quality is, a moment of sadness. So you see that almost contagious stress or contagious pain or contagious sadness be activated in the brain. That's one of the very first things that happens. And too often people get overwhelmed by that. They're like, did not want to catch other people's stress. And they start to regulate, not to use that as a catalyst for something good, but they try to regulate it down to suppress it. And that's where you'll see people distancing themselves, or literally leaving the room, or putting on their psychological armor, or getting drunk. I mean, there's a lot of things people can do to try to downregulate that. But when you watch compassion unfold, and by the way, when people are probably like, where is this research coming from? You may have already heard this in this entire series, but some of this research comes from taking people who've dedicated their lives to training in compassion meditation and asking them to do compassion in their minds and see what happens. It also comes from training ordinary citizens in trying to cultivate compassion, and then looking at what changes in their brains as they are confronted with suffering once they have actually worked on developing compassion. It comes from studies looking at people who haven't been trained at all and simply are reporting that they're feeling great compassion. So is it, a lot of interesting resources where what happens in the brain comes from. Okay, so we've got the sympathetic stress. And then what comes on next is often social cognition, the part of the brain that thinks about somebody else's experience. And what's really key about this is that we often talk about compassion as a merging of self with other, but the social cognition actually often puts some boundaries around it. So you become very aware that you are reflecting on and responding to someone else's suffering. This is not your suffering, which is what it can feel like in that first moment of sympathetic distress. And so the areas of social cognition, which midline structures of the brain and the side of the cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, areas of the brain that basically allow you to think about other people's experiences and understand yourself as related to, but also distinct from that other, seems to be really important for having this balanced approach, so that you don't feel completely overwhelmed by the suffering that you're confronted with, and you don't fall into this sort of downward spiral of, now I'm suffering, and now I'm scared, and now I'm sad, and now I just need to escape all the suffering. It's mine now. And then what you start to see unfolding next is the reward system, or what's typically described as the reward system, areas deep in the midbrain, areas like the ventral tegmental area, areas that produce and release dopamine and send it through to the frontal parts of the brain to get you to feel hopeful and to activate the approach motivation system of the brain. So the idea is that you have the sense that I want to get closer to whatever's triggering this brain activation. And it's what leads people to have courage in the face of suffering, or it's what leads people to become caregivers when they see someone in distress. It's that instinct that says something good is going to happen if I help, if I hug, if I stay put instead of run away. And those are the three main systems that you see becoming engaged during the unfolding process of compassion. And if you look at it neurochemically, you do see things like dopamine and also oxytocin, which is part of that caregiving system and network. And they can also fine-tune what's happening in your autonomic nervous system so that you have social engagement rather than a panic response or a fight response, which might allow you to respond, but to do it in a way that is not necessarily as skillful as you would from a more balanced state. But I think so I don't know how you feel about that little description, but in my experience, it's given people a lot of room to then nuance when their own response to suffering does not unfold in that way, because then it starts to point to what you can do, where you can put your attention, what you can choose to think about, or what actions you can take to stay on the compassion train.
Wow, thanks. I think there was so much in that answer that I'd love to explore a little bit deeper a few of the things you said, starting with stress, because you
Mm-hmm.
describe compassion as coming actually out of the stress response, and that might be counterintuitive to some people. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to us a little bit more about, what is the definition of stress? What do we know about stress from the research, and how exactly does stress lead to compassion?
Yeah, so stress is basically what's keeping us alive. I mean, literally at the level of the cortisol awakening response, like you need some stress hormones to get you out of bed in the morning. So stress obviously has a bad rap, and for some reasons that are legitimate and others that are more related to misunderstanding of how integral stress is to our functioning as human beings. So if you look at older scientific definitions of stress, things like Hans Selye's definition of stress, he defines stress as basically anything you experience in life that requires you to adapt or respond, and that would give rise to a stress response. So that includes a lot. I tend to use a slightly more modern definition of stress. I do like to keep the focus on the response rather than the stressor, rather than the situation or the circumstance. So I define stress as what arises in your mind and body, and what arises in communities or in relationships when something that you care about is at stake. And your brain, your body has a great repertoire of physiological responses to help you respond when something that you care about is at stake. And that includes some standard stress responses everyone knows, like fight or flee or freeze. It also includes other stress responses that are only been more recently explored in the last couple of decades, like a challenge response, which is basically just your body giving you a lot of energy and focus and positive emotions to help you engage with something that is difficult but meaningful. A tend and befriend response, which is like a social stress response, where the physiology of it encourages you to connect with others, to team up with others, or to even protect and defend others. So there's a multitude of stress responses, but basically stress is your brain and body saying, go time. This is a moment that matters. Now is not the time to take a nap. Although, maybe someday we'll find out that there actually is a stress response that is basically trying to drive you to sleep. I don't actually know if anyone has found that yet. There must be one. There's even a pause and plan response, which is about slowing down in the face of stress to give you a chance to figure out what your best options are. So with that in mind, it makes total sense why compassion would be an offshoot of a stress response, although it's not traditionally defined as a stress response, mostly I think because of just cultural reasons. There's no reason you could not define and describe compassion as a stress response, because when you look at it physiologically, it does move around stress hormones in an interesting way. It mobilizes energy to allow you to engage. It looks in some ways like a challenge response. It's like if you were to marry a challenge response with a tend and befriend response, that's what compassion seems to look like. So you could, but we have such a negative connotation with stress that, it's hard enough asking people to be brave, which compassion requires, and to be kind, which compassion requires. Maybe it's not so good to call it stress also, because then people are going to think that being compassionate is going to give them a heart attack and, shave 10 years off their life because stress is so bad for you. So I won't make like a hard argument for it, but certainly it's intellectually defensible. And when you understand that, it can help you understand why compassion sometimes feels initially overwhelming, can flood you with energy. And it can also, I think, help us understand why compassion fatigue is a real thing. And I will say that these are fighting words in the contemplative traditions and among scientists and psychologists who are interested in compassion. So I don't know if anyone has talked about compassion fatigue in this series yet, But whenever I use those words, I can guarantee there will be people who are upset to put those two words together, because there is a belief that true compassion cannot be fatiguing and cannot be fatigued, because compassion is just love or something like that. I don't want to make their argument for them. They could make a very interesting argument towards that. But in my experience working with healthcare providers and educators and trauma responders and people who work in law enforcement and many other professions, the fatigue is real, because compassion requires you to pay sustained attention to the suffering of others, to marshal your own inner resources, to relieve that suffering. And like any other kind of meaningful action, I mean, any kind of meaningful action, parenting, playing sports, whatever you're doing, when you're marshaling your own resources and pointing it in a particular direction, it can be fatiguing. And because compassion has some of these elements of a stress response, where it really is mobilizing a lot of energy and flooding you with hormones, including dopamine, that can be very energizing in the moment, there's often a need to slow down and nourish yourself and sustain yourself through any of the ways that you might typically do that, through connecting with loved ones, through sleep, through good nourishment, through hobbies, listening to music, prayer, whatever it is. But that is part of the cycle of compassion, and not to view compassion as a sort of ideal trait that is limitless and boundless, that you never need to train and that never needs to be nourished. So again, thinking about compassion from that point of view, I think helps people understand why no matter how compassionate you are, you may not have unlimited resources that can be fueled purely by your good heart, your good motivation. It needs to be fueled by something else also.
Wow, I'd really love to pick up on your fighting words, and thank you for to put your views and experience out there. And we have talked about compassion fatigue in this series already, and some of the literature and the discussion that I've had with other people in this field, sometimes they talk about empathic distress fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes talk about secondary trauma.
Yeah.
Or vicarious trauma. So in your view, are these concepts related? Are they similar? Are they different? Compassion fatigue, empathic distress fatigue, secondary trauma. What's the relationship between these, and how can a provider?
Yeah, and I would add moral distress to
Yes.
that category too. I think of these as things that contribute to compassion fatigue and burnout, but they aren't necessarily synonyms for it. They're nuanced. In the way that I could say, like, depression is a thing, and all the things that you described could contribute to depression. If you're being asked to do things that are inconsistent with your values, or you're unable to do things that you think would relieve suffering, right? That sort of moral distress, that can lead to burnout, it can lead to depression, and it can lead to compassion fatigue. Vicarious trauma, that sense that you are taking on the suffering of others, that can also contribute to depression and burnout and compassion fatigue. But the reason I like, I'm almost like a philosopher in this way. I like having these different definitions, because I think just not so we can argue over them, but so that we can really reflect on our experiences and give language to things that then allow us to accept them, understand maybe the common humanity of them, and then look for strategies to remedy them if that's necessary. So compassion fatigue, the reason I like those terms is because they suggest a state in which you may have continued motivation to care, but you don't have the resources or the energy to do it in a way that gives you compassion satisfaction. So you can look at any of those other factors I described as getting in the way of compassion satisfaction or compassionate engagement. But I think just to flat out say, I'm exhausted from trying to help, and I feel like I don't have a lot left to give. Sometimes we talk about burnout as losing that compassionate motivation. Sometimes we talk about empathic distress as being just overwhelmed by suffering, but compassion fatigue is I think it's something kind of specific. That is, the desire is still there, but the sense of being able to engage with joy and with satisfaction, that's really what's depleted. And it may be depleted because of structural factors and the system, or it may be depleted because you yourself are struggling with mental health issues or physical health issues, or there's so many reasons it could be, but we can describe it as a state of wanting to engage, but not having the energy to engage. And that's, I hear that a lot from people. And sometimes burnout, like we could talk forever about the nuances of these as psychological states, in the same way that positive emotions have like these wonderful nuances that we can celebrate. But that's why I choose to use that. And I don't think immediately shifting to saying, no, it's not the compassion that's fatiguing you. It's the empathic distress that's fatiguing you. So just keep helping people. Just keep, no, that can also be exhausting. It is not only empathic distress that is exhausting. Actually delivering compassion can also be exhausting, particularly if you are not receiving compassion and not open to receiving compassion from others. Often in healthcare, I talk about sustainable compassion, which means you not are just sustaining your ability to give compassion toward others, but you have to consciously train yourself to be open to the compassion that is around you, which can mean a couple of things. One is noticing you aren't the only one. You're not the only one who can do it. You're not the only one who cares. It's not you or nobody, and it never gets done, which is, I think, a mindset that particularly people who have skills and resources and high levels of accountability, like in healthcare, people often start to feel that sense of responsibility, like it's all on me. And part of sustainable compassion is looking around and being like, oh, I'm part of a team. I'm part of a community. There is a, hopefully, right? And this is sometimes we get into trouble in systems that don't make this obvious, but hopefully you sense yourself as part of a bigger than self compassion. And then the other is opening to receiving compassion from others. So do you let other people help you? If you haven't eaten a meal recently, are you going to, take that when somebody says, let me take care of that one detail for you so that you can take 5 minutes to grab a snack? Even that small level of compassion, are you willing to receive it? Or do you suddenly feel like, I can't show my weakness, I don't want to like get into a tit for tat, now I'm going to owe someone a favor, like let me just keep all my problems and struggle to myself so that I don't become interdependent with others in a way that makes me uncomfortable. So that's part of sustainable compassion, and part of what can, again, these are issues that are a little bit different than things like empathic distress or vicarious trauma, things that can strengthen our compassion and energy.
Thank you. And while we're philosophizing, I guess I would love to hear your views on what is the relationship between mindfulness and compassion, because this is the Mindful Healthcare Summit. And a lot of time today talking about compassion, and many people view them as similar, many people view them as different. What's your view on that? And what does the research show on the similarities and differences between mindfulness and compassion?
Yeah. Well, let's start with just some very simple research findings. There are, I think, two types of findings you can see in the literature. One is that when people train in mindfulness, they are better able or more willing to notice the suffering of others. And like that's the first step of compassion. So at a very basic level, when you train yourself to pay attention in a particular way, you are more likely to be open to the suffering that is around you, and therefore often more likely to help when you can. There's also research showing that mindfulness can increase the positive aspects of helping others and decrease, not eliminate, but decrease some of the negative aspects of helping others. Barbara Fredrickson, I believe, with a whole team has shown that mindfulness is associated with more positive emotions like feeling connected, feeling hopeful when helping others, and less likely to feel disgust or judgment or empathic distress while helping others. So there's something about being able to notice suffering. There's also something about the experience of engaging with suffering that changes. And then, I would go way back to what the definition of mindfulness is and why mindfulness is so supportive of compassion in a profession like healthcare. Because I will say that there are individuals and groups I have spoken to where at the end of the day, I felt like, I don't know that I brought any value here because I'm not sure we're starting from the same values. So if I train you in mindfulness, I don't know what I'm strengthening, but it might not be compassion if that motivation is not already there. And one way to define mindfulness is it starts by remembering what's important to you and remembering what matters. And you literally fill your mind with what matters most. And many contemplative traditions and spiritual traditions start with values and ethics before you go into advanced mindfulness or mind training. for a reason. You want to point this mindfulness practice in the direction of something something that is useful or productive to society. So if you define mindfulness as developing a quality of attention that helps you enact your values, then it becomes very clear how mindfulness can support compassion in healthcare in a way that might not be true if you didn't already start from a place of wanting to relieve suffering or contribute or help others. And that's already a given for most people in healthcare. So you can think of mindfulness as training your ability to pay attention in a way that allows you to align yourself in that direction, to notice when things are out of alignment, to put your energy toward what matters most, to work with the states of mind or the states of body that are barriers to compassion. And it allows you to be more skillful in that way. So I think of many mindfulness practices as basically preparing you to engage with the world in a way that's consistent with your values. And if compassion is your value, it will show up in that way.
Great, thank you for that. I think that'll give all of our viewers a lot of food for thought. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the compassion cultivation training. How was it developed? What does the research show on how it affects individuals as well as systems and organizations?
So it was initially developed by Thupten Jinpa, who did he participate in the summit? Actually, I should ask.
No. I'm not sure.
Okay, so he is known by many as the senior translator for the Dalai Lama, and he, in his own right, is an amazing scholar of contemplative traditions and practices. And the initial idea was to try to develop a program that could do for compassion practices what MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, had done for mindfulness practices. That is, put together a program that is accessible, that is secular or inclusive of multiple religious faiths and traditions, even though it is inspired by practices from Buddhism. And that could be studied scientifically to find out if practices delivered in this way are of any benefit. And with a sincere inquiry, like not yet knowing, can we translate this in a way that helps people, and is 8 weeks of training going to do any good? So that was the idea. And it was developed at Stanford with Jinpa and a number of psychologists and practitioners, including myself. And we spent a few years first just trying to figure out if people do 20 to 30 minutes of compassion meditation a day, or we ask them to, and they end up doing it maybe every other day or a couple times a week. Like, do you see changes in their self-reported compassion, self-compassion, relationships with others, that sort of thing? So we refined the program. It's very similar to MBSR in that you show up, you take a class once a week, you get access to recordings of meditations that guide you through the development of compassion for yourself and for others. And we do things in the classroom that allow you to practice these skills and to talk about your own suffering and how you engage with suffering in your life in meaningful ways. So it's also creating a little bit of a community that reinforces the value of compassion, but also allows you to receive compassion. I think that's a really important part of the CCT experiences, because you do have this kind of safe place to talk about the struggles in your own life. You become a recipient of the group's compassion as well as your own compassion, which is a really nice part of the program. So, we were working on it, refining it, doing some initial pilot tests, and this program has only existed for about 10 years. So in my mind, that's early days. I don't know by other people's standards, but in my mind, that's early days. There have been a number of studies that we've published, and there are now other research groups have begun to do research on it too. I wouldn't want to oversell, but some of the things that we've seen that I always tell our teachers, we've now trained, I don't know, I think it's fewer than 200, but maybe around 150 to 200 trainers around the world in this program. I always say, you can tell people what might be possible, right, if they do these practices or take this class. And it seems to be what's possible is people report more confidence and courage around compassion, less fear about showing compassion towards others, less reservations about receiving compassion from others, more ability to offer themselves compassion. So the kind of things you would expect if you're training compassion. But also, one of my favorite findings we found early on was an increased correlation between taking care of others and taking care of yourself. We found at the beginning of the study, there was no correlation. And often the people in that particular study were already helping others quite a bit. and not doing something every day to take care of themselves. And by the end of the program, we saw the taking care of self rise up, so that on days when people helped others, they also were more likely to do something to help themselves. I love that finding. That finding, by the way, the journal editors told us to cut it out because it wasn't important. I was like, that healthcare providers will understand why that was an important finding. We've also seen from some external research sort of outside of our core research group that other people will report positive changes. So if you ask participants to ask like their spouse, are there any positive changes for taking this program? People in your life will see positive changes as a result. And a couple of studies have been done with healthcare providers, small studies, positive effects. One study that I did showed improvement in scores related to burnout with physicians at Stanford, but it was such a small study. I don't think that I wouldn't want to put heavy promises ahead of where the data is. But I think if you look more broadly at programs like CCT, you do see this emerging data that suggests one of the things that compassion meditation and training in compassion can do is it increases this kind of reserve that I've been talking about. It gives people more courage to enact their value of compassion. It gives people a broader access to compassion that is not just, I'm going to be compassionate to my patients or my kids, but I'm going to also be compassionate toward myself. I'm going to allow myself to receive compassion. I'm going to allow myself to notice compassion in others and be inspired by that. So we're broadening people's access to many different aspects of compassion that are sustaining. And we're starting to see some positive outcomes around things like depression and stress and anxiety. And some of our early work pointed to that too. But again, one of the things that, since we're talking about training compassion, one of the things I want to emphasize is compassion is by its nature bigger than self. So if anyone has this idea, I'm going to improve my compassion so I can lower my blood pressure, I don't see how it works. And I don't mean that in a moralistic way. I just don't see how it works, because compassion itself is so fundamentally interdependent and bigger than self that the last thing I would want to do is try to sell the benefits of compassion as really self-focused outcomes, and to think of compassion as a strategic means to getting to self-focused benefits. When I think, and particularly in healthcare, what we can point to and say with confidence is compassion benefits everyone in the system. Compassion can benefit the person offering it by providing a sense of purpose and compassion satisfaction. Compassion benefits the person receiving it, whether we're looking at, improved healing or improved hope. It certainly benefits the people who witness it, the family members who feel good about their, taking their family member to this hospital or to this healthcare setting. They themselves have more hope. They feel respected. To your colleagues who witness the compassion, who feel like, wow, I'm working in a place where people care. I mean, compassion can benefit everyone. And it also, it includes yourself. But I think whenever we're talking about, should we bring something like CCT into a hospital? Should we train our doctors in it? Should we train our staff in it? People so often want to go to the, it'll reduce burnout and it'll improve your immune function or something like that. And I think the right way to think about it is compassion benefits everyone when it is this particular kind of compassion that is sustainable and that is by its nature bigger than self.
Well, I really love hearing about compassion being bigger than self, because often when I talk to health professionals and we talk about burnout or compassion fatigue or wellness, there are sometimes people who say, the problems are really systemic. It's not because I just need to meditate more. It's actually, we need to change the system. So what would you say to folks who don't really see the point of meditation, and they say, no, we actually just need to change the system so that way we're not burning our health professionals out? What does compassion training have to do in that situation?
So this is where my moderate amount of improv training comes into handy. This is a yes and situation. Yes, there are a lot of problems in systems and structures and policies. I hear it everywhere. And I hear it with anger and rage often from physicians who have seen changes implemented in their workplaces that just make it's just overwhelming what you have to do that feels divorced from the meaning of why you're doing what you're doing. And also that combines like the super high level of accountability without a super high level of autonomy. So I just want to acknowledge, I understand that. And yet at the same time, who's going to change the system and how are you going to change the system? Hopefully you, all of us, and that's going to be hard and difficult. And what are you going to do in the meantime? So I completely agree that it's not like you should say, eat an apple and meditate. That's like the suck it up buttercup kind of, I don't know, mindfulness strategy. And that's not quite right. But it's how are you going to change the system? Hopefully with courage and with compassion and with a sense of energy and purpose and hope, and that you're not doing it on your own. And if you're going to be an advocate for yourself, an advocate for your patient, an advocate for change, that is a form of compassion. Like, that's not different than compassion, because it's about noticing suffering and deciding that you want to relieve that suffering and finding a skillful way to engage, even if it's hard and even if it comes with some stress, but also taking some satisfaction from the fact that you're willing to engage with that suffering. That's what the process of change looks like. And that's different than complaining, right? And it's also different than trying to practice self-improvement or self-care with a sense of hopelessness about the system. So I think it's all, and there's not a great answer to this, because it's all hard. And this is one resource, and it should never be thought of as the Band-Aid so that we can continue ignoring. And this is not just for healthcare, right? This is for all of society's problems. And I find myself having similar conversations with people who are interested in politics or interested in social work, that we need this kind of compassion, because by nature, the very work of change is a form of compassion.
So it sounds like training ourselves in compassion might help us to be more effective in our work to change this system, and more able to do that in a way that aligns with our values.
I do, and I think this is where mindfulness comes in too, because we have to be willing to see the causes of suffering. And we live in a society that gains benefit from trying to individualize all problems and all negative outcome. I mean, even the healthcare system does it by pathologizing behaviors, as opposed to looking at the social causes and determinants of health. Right? I mean, we all do it all the time. This is like the nature of modern society. And so it's important for us to be able to step back and look at other things that can be changed, and that the qualities of mindfulness that we're cultivating through, whether it's reflection, meditation, direct inquiry through conversations that are rooted in the mindfulness tradition, will hopefully help us become more discerning and willing to put our energy and attention on what is most likely to drive positive change or reduction in suffering.
Yeah, and when I think about positive change for the future, as an academic pediatrician, I teach a lot of residents and medical students and fellows. Do you see a role for compassion cultivation training for our healthcare trainees? Do you have some experience, or is there any research on that? When should we be starting this?
Yes, there are a few studies. Off the top of my head, I can't remember who the lead researchers were. I've seen a number of small studies looking at both mindfulness and compassion training among medical students and among residents, showing just the benefits you would expect, that it can stave off reduction in empathy that you often see through the training process. It can reduce symptoms of depression, which is endemic in the field of medicine. And these are small studies, but they suggest it's certainly never too early to start. And anyone who's ever talked to a medical student knows it's like dropping someone into the deep end of suffering often for people who are surprised by the intensity, not just of the stress, but often whether it's because of the challenges of the system or, I won't speculate, not being a medical student myself or a physician, but it's certainly true that people often experience a certain intensity of suffering for the first time in their medical training, and maybe first episode of depression or first episode of suicidal thinking. And there is growing evidence that compassion training and mindfulness training may be a benefit, including reducing suicidal risk. There are a couple of studies now demonstrating that for people who either already have been at risk for or even one study looking at the benefits of compassion training for people who've already actually attempted suicide. And so I think that that's, I mean, like, people don't often like to talk about that as a reality of healthcare and medicine, but it certainly is. And this may be one tool to help support people.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you just pointing out the realities of the situation that health professionals face. And I think you've given us a lot of tools, some research about how we can cultivate compassion, how it's not something that we're just born with, but it's something that we can train, and how it can help us to take better care of ourselves, better care of our patients, and also to improve the system so that way it works better for all of us. So I really appreciate you sharing all of this. Do you have any last thoughts for the visitors, the viewers, any last things that you'd like them to leave today with?
I would say if people are interested in the programs that are related to the ideas we've been talking about, CCT is one, and it's available online and in many different parts of the world. But there are other programs too, which you may or may not have been exposed to in the summit. There's the cognitive-based compassion training that was developed out of Emory that is also becoming more widely available. There is the mindful self-compassion training program. There is the mindful communication program that came out of from Krasner and Epstein. I think it's called the Mindful Communication in Medicine program.
Called Mindful Practice.
Okay.
Epstein and Krasner out of the University of Rochester, yes. Mindful Practice.
Highly recommend that because they make the manual available online. Like, you can Google it and get the manual and try it. So there are a lot of programs. I would encourage people just to research what's available and what's near you, and to explore what supports you.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much, Kelly. And thank you to our viewers, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and bring some compassion and mindfulness into it.